Okay, hi everyone. Here's the first part of chapter 12, the central nervous system. So we're going to look at the different parts of the brain and the spinal cord and see how it all works. Okay, so first, the central nervous system, as you know, is the brain and spinal cord. And this term cephalization means that you have a brain that is connected to neurons in your body. That's what being cephalized means. And we are the most cephalized organism. Okay. So starting out, your brain starts as a neural tube, and then it begins to form different parts. And so some of the parts it'll form are the forebrain, the midbrain, and the high-brain, or the procephalon, mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. And so that's eventually going to develop into the brain. And then the forebrain develops even more into the telencephalon and the diencephalon. Midbrain stays the same, and then hindbrain turns into the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. Okay, then they develop more. The telencephalon turns into two hemispheres, which are the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. The diencephalon becomes the epithalamus, thalamus, hypothalamus, and then the retina. And the mesencephalon stays the midbrain. The metencephalon becomes the pons and cerebellum, which we'll learn about. And then the myelencephalon becomes the medulla oblongata, which you might have heard of. And then the central cavity of the neural tube becomes the ventricles, which are like the inside of the brain. So here's that process and how it develops. And then the forebrain moves down towards the brainstem, and the brainstem is made of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So this is like week 5. This is before a woman even knows she's pregnant generally, or right when you're getting a positive pregnancy test, and this is what the brain looks like of a developing fetus. And then week 13 here, you can see the cerebral hemispheres are starting to grow. Okay, so now we're on to adult brain. So there's 4 main regions that we'll look at: the cerebral hemispheres, which is what you think of the brain, the diencephalon, and then the brainstem, which is the midbrain, pons, medulla, and then the cerebellum, which is the back of your brain. So here it is: cerebral hemispheres, the big part of your brain, that's the smart part. Diencephalon is right in the center. Brainstem is this green part, and then cerebellum is back here. And generally, the most important parts of your brain are going to be deep on the inside, and they're well protected from everything else. Okay, so in your brain you have gray matter and white matter. The gray matter, and you've probably heard of this, but it's real. The gray matter is the short, non-myelinated neurons and like the cell body end of the neurons, and then the tail ends, the axons, are the white matter, and they're white because they're fattier because they have myelin. So in the central nervous system, you have gray matter and white matter. And then you'll see a similar pattern in the spinal cord. So if you do a cross section right here, you'll see gray matter right here, and then you'll see white matter right here. So these are the cell bodies, and these are the tails. So this part's myelinated, and it's fatty. That's why it looks white. Okay, the brainstem also has gray matter with white matter. And then you'll see an outer layer on the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so I think we're cut right here looking, and you can see gray matter, white matter, and then some more gray matter out here. So, and then if you look here, you see gray matter here and on the outside, and then there's white matter intermixed. So these are the myelinated tails, and then these are the heads or cell bodies. Heads or cell bodies. So it's just which way they're oriented. Okay, then you have these ventricles, and these are chambers that have cerebral spinal fluid. They have neuroglial cells, if you remember those. Those are like the helper cells. Okay, so the ventricles are C-shaped, and you'll find them in each hemisphere. And then there's a third ventricle that's in the diencephalon, and a fourth ventricle that's in the hindbrain. And so here that they are. These are the lateral ventricles here, and then the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. So they're all kind of interspersed. These are C-shaped, right? The lateral ventricles are C-shaped. And then third ventricle and fourth ventricle. Okay. So the cerebral hemisphere, your cerebrum, is the biggest part of your brain. That's what makes you smart. 83% of your brain mass. It's got a bunch of different features, and this is, remember, structure and function are intricately woven together. So it has ridges, which are called gyri, or a gyrus, singular. Sulci is the shallow grooves, fissures or deep grooves. There's longitudinal and transverse ones. So this looks like a real brain, and you can see right here's the frontal lobe, occipital lobe back here, parietal lobes in the middle. And then you can see like this longitudinal fissure here, and then you can see some of the other fissures and all these little nooks and crannies and curves. Okay, so frontal lobe is all of this, parietal lobe is right here, occipital lobe is back here, and then your temporal lobe is your temples, and then your cerebellum is back here. Okay. Okay, so the sulci can be divided into 5 lobes, like I just showed you. I showed you 4: the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and insula. The first 4 are named, they match their skull bones, right? So temporal, parietal, and frontal is underneath the insular is under the temporal, parietal, and frontal, but the temporal, parietal, frontal, and occipital match their skull bones. Okay, so, and then you can see, like, here's a sulcus. This is a gyrus here. This is a fissure because it's deeper. A gyrus is a ridge. The sulcus is a smaller groove, and this is important. How deep these grooves are affect your brain function. So you'll hear about that in like neuroscience. And then inside of here, this is the insula. So it's underneath these lobes, the frontal, parietal, and temporal. There's your insula. Okay. So I think I already showed you this. And there's 3 basic regions. The cerebral cortex is where there's gray matter, and then white matter kind of in the middle, and then basal nuclei. I think we already have this picture. Okay, so cerebral cortex is the smart part of our brain. This is what makes humans smart and unique. Side of conscious mind, so awareness, sensory perception, voluntary motor initiation, communication, memory storage, understanding, learning, all of those, critical thinking, all those things. The cerebral cortex is just the outside, though. Cortex means outside, right? So that's your 2 to 4 millimeters of gray matter on the outside. And remember, it's gray matter because it has a lot of cell bodies and dendrites, but no axons, because the axons are fatty, so they're white. So this is 40% of the brain. You can see what's going on in the cerebral cortex using PET scans or MRI scans to see which parts are active and what they do. So here's an example, like you can tell what parts of the brain are used for different things. This is a functional MRI. So this is the type of MRI where people can do tasks and then they can scan their brain and see what they're doing. So seeing, hearing, thinking, speaking, all use different parts of the brain. Okay, so in the cerebral cortex, there's 3 main areas. There's motor areas, and then sensory areas and association areas, which is where those 2, the motor and the sensory, kind of meet. So you get sensory input, it goes to the associative areas, and then that goes to the motor areas when you decide what to do, when your brain decides what to do. It is contralateral, so that each hemisphere is running the opposite side of the body. That is true. And then there are some functions that are only on one side. Okay, so motor areas are in the frontal lobe and other areas too. So frontal lobe does voluntary movement. You have primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex, and then you also have an area called Broca's area, which has to do with speech. And then frontal eye field is also part of the motor area. So let's see. So motor areas all here, right here is the frontal, like this whole, let me outline it here. This whole section right here is your frontal lobe. This is your primary motor cortex and your premotor cortex. So this is right in front of the parietal. Parietal cuts off like right here. And then Broca's area is right here. And then these are some, like your prefrontal lobe and your frontal lobe, these are some really important parts for executive functioning. So you can see some of those functions right there. Okay, so the primary motor cortex we saw, that's right next to the parietal lobe. And it's a really interesting area. So this runs like the voluntary motor movements, conscious control of precise skilled skeletal movements. And this is called the homunculus. I don't know why they don't have the title here, but this is a really cool picture that shows you, let's see, right here, pink is motor. So this is your anterior side. And then blue is sensory. So this is showing you what part of your motor cortex is running different parts of your brain. So this is like a cross section coming, or sorry, different parts of your body. This is a cross section coming down this way, is going this way. And you can see different parts of this motor cortex run different parts of your body. And so if you have damage to any of these parts, you're going to have to, like if you have a stroke, and it affects any of these areas, it's going to affect how you move. And then right behind that is parietal, and this is your sensory cortex, and that's going to affect your sense of feeling, and that's where they're located. Okay, so then the premotor cortex is just anterior to the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. This is for learned, repetitious, patterned motor skills, sequential actions, voluntary actions that depend on sensory feedback. Broca's area is motor speech. So this is like making speech, like producing speech. And people can be challenged in this sometimes. And then the frontal eye field does voluntary eye movements. So right here's Broca's area. If there's damage to that area, you're going to have trouble like initiating speech. Back here is Wernicke's area. This is another speech area. It's in the temporal lobe though, and it's temporal and parietal, I think, and it's understanding speech. So that's in a different part, but they're both right near your ear, which is cool. Okay, and then let's see. We've got a few other cool structures here. Here's the olfactory bulb, that's for smell, and the olfactory tract is right behind it. Let me see what else. Your frontal eye field is right here. This is your prefrontal cortex. That just means it's the very front of your frontal cortex. Your primary motor cortex is back here, and then this is your primary somatosensory cortex, so this is sensory, and then parietal lobe is right here. Occipital lobe is back here for vision, and then temporal lobe is right here. Okay, so if you damage your primary motor cortex, like I said, like if you have a stroke or something, that's going to cause paralysis on the opposite side of the body, and it depends on where in the homunculus your damage is done and what body parts you won't be able to move. If muscle strength is impaired, there might be damage to your premotor area, so they can kind of determine where that is. Okay, your sensory area is right behind, like right where the parietal lobe is, this is sensation. And there's 8 main areas, so primary somatosensory cortex, somatosensory association cortex, visual areas, auditory, vestibular cortex, olfactory, gustatory, which is taste, and visceral. Okay, so, and that same homunculus is, like that I showed you, applies to this. Like it's the same homunculus, except this is for sensory. So here it is. This is that part right there, cross section. And this is where in your brain these different areas are felt. So this helps you understand what you're feeling and what information you're getting from the environment. Okay, so you have this visual areas, and this is in the occipital lobe. it receives, like when your retina receives information and you have an image on the back of your retina, this part is going to receive that information and then your brain will process it. And then you also have visual association area, which kind of helps you process that information, and it uses past visual experiences to figure things out, to figure out what you're seeing. Auditory areas are, you have the primary auditory cortex. This is in your temporal lobe. So this gets information from your inner ear and makes sense of it. And then you have auditory association area, kind of like visual, and this helps you make sense of it and understand what you're hearing. The vestibular cortex helps you with balance. And then olfactory is with smell. So that's going to help. That's going to work with the olfactory bulbs and tracts. Gustatory is taste. And then visceral is like understanding what your feelings are that are happening inside your body, like upset stomach, bladder, some of those visceral feelings that we have. Okay, so we already saw this, I think, but some of these parts are here. So find them and figure out what part of the brain they're in. And I think we saw this picture too, yeah. If you have damage to one of these, it's going to cause a problem, like primary visual cortex will cause blindness. Some area, or the multimodal association area, is going to receive information from multiple areas, put them all together and figure out what they mean, and then that's going to cause us to think and act. And then we have an anterior association area in your prefrontal cortex, and you might have heard of that. It's a really important area. It's underdeveloped in adolescence. Hopefully yours is well developed. It helps you with intellect, cognition, recall, personality, judgment, reasoning, persistence, planning. It's like your executive functioning center. Posterior association center is partly in your temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. Helps you with recognizing patterns in faces and understanding language, both written and spoken, and that's called Wernicke's area, which I've shown you. Your limbic association area helps you with emotional impact and helps us with memories. And if you have tumors in like the anterior association area in your prefrontal lobe, it'll affect loss of judgment, attentiveness, inhibitions. So it just makes sense. If you have a disorder in one of those areas, it's going to affect that. If you have lesions on the posterior part, they might refuse to wash or address the side of the body with a lesion. It doesn't belong to me. You're going to see symptoms of that. So lateralization is that you have different things on each side of your brain, and they do control different things, different parts of the body, but the hemispheres are not identical. For example, for language, 90% use the left side. That's why most of us are right-handed. So that each hemisphere is not the same. They're not equal. They have different things on different sides. So left hemisphere does control more language, math, logic. Right side is visual, spatial skills, intuition, emotion, artistic, and musical skills. Those things are true.